Hello, week 40, 51, book 51. We're almost done. And this is it. Octavia Butler, Octavia E. Butler, Fledgling. Okay, so um, this book was published in 2005, uh, and just a few months after its publication in 2006, Octavia Butler abruptly died. It was a relatively unexpected death. She was, I think, 58, um, still young enough to have written several other books. Um, this is the first book in what was probably intended as a series of at least three books dealing with the issues this book raises and taking them further. She also left undone another series, um, Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, and the third book, Parable of the Trickster, was never finished because she was suffering severe writer's block. So the parable books were the ones she was really focused on, and she couldn't finish the third one. She had massive notes for it, but she got distracted and suffered massive writer's block because it's a dystopian story, um, and apparently the bleakness and the lack of hope in it made it difficult for her to write. So what she says is she had the world crafted. She was known for um, world crafting in sci-fi. I mean, that was her one of her big claims to fame is being able to craft these worlds. She had the world crafted, but she didn't have the plot. She didn't have a story. Um, and some people may not realize that there's a strong difference between the two. That just because you have a sufficient world doesn't mean you have a plot. And just because you have a plot doesn't mean you have a filled out world. And she was concerned to have both. She is, well, since her death, she's become a massive name in science fiction. And and she did win several awards and did well with those. But it wasn't really till after her death that she became more of a mainstream figure. Fledgling, her last book. What is it about? Well, it's a vampire story, kind of. The main character is a creature called an Inna, an INA, who um, has lost her memory through trauma. And she wakes up in a very traumatic state. And if you've read other Butler, this is very similar to the feel of how the first Lilith Brood novel, Dawn, begins with coming awake in an unusual environment. Um, in this case, it is after massive trauma that would have killed a human being several times over. But because she's not human, she survives. And she's very primal and very animalistic at first. And this is going to come back to haunt other aspects of the novel later, as is this trauma. Um, and what she is a genetic experiment in the world. And this is all huge spoilers, and there's no way to talk about this book without spoilers because the whole point of the book is the things I'm about to talk about. And the book makes no and talking about the book and reviewing it makes no sense without these issues. She is by Ena terms, she's 53, which is still a child, and to represent that, she has the body of a child. Essentially, a she looks like a 12-year-old human being, but she's not fully human. She's not fully Ena. She is a genetic hybrid, and she's specifically a dark-skinned hybrid. And Ina are very specifically tall and very, very white. She's not white. She's dark-skinned, and this is going to become a major theme towards the end of the book. At first, it's barely mentioned and is essentially irrelevant because Butler is focusing on her inner life and the world from her point of view. And we do get some hints early on that she's probably what we would consider to be an African American. And we do get that confirmed by just regular people she hangs around with. But that becomes an issue only later. At this point in the book, the early part, no one has any particular issue with that. It's just a detail of who she is. Um, so she is in an environment where everything has been burned and destroyed, and she doesn't know why. And she brutalizes a couple of things. She eats a couple of deer raw and things like this, and this rebuilds her body. We find out later that Ina, who are basically like vampires, don't normally need food. They need blood, and specifically human blood. But when they need to rebuild their cellular structure through injury, it is good to have the protein, the flesh. So biologically, if you pay attention there, she's done something that is often just overlooked or ignored in vampire lore, which she has made them actually biologically plausible. Now, real? No. It's still fantasy, obviously. But there's at least possibility there of it being somewhat real. Okay, so what do we have going on here? Well, she wanders out of this area, the main character, whose name I just had on the tip of my tongue. Uh, well, uh, Shori. Her name is Shori. Um, and Shori wanders, she doesn't remember her name. She gets called Renee early on because that's what one of the human characters around here gives her as a name. So she wanders down out of this mountainous area as very rural, kind of secluded area where she woke up, and she's found by a man. And this is where it gets creepy. Remember, she has a physical appearance of a 12-year-old. Well, this man picks her up, and things get physical, sexual very quickly with them. And it does so before he's aware of what she is, which he does suffer some guilt and some issues for. But she's not freaking 14, 15, 16. She's freaking 12. In fact, 10, 11. Okay, so this is um, creepy, creepy, creepy Lolita territory. I mean, at least like, a 16-year-old one can plausibly claim, well, she looked adult, she talked adult, she acted adult. It's still a crime, and I'm absolutely not excusing it in any way. But that's a completely different situation than a 10, 11, 12-year-old who's clearly underage. There's no question. Um, Now, it has to be admitted that she's not human, and she's actually 53. So I mean, by 53, I mean she has physically been on the planet for 53 years. So she's perfectly old enough to consent. She doesn't look like she is. And this is similar to issues in Twilight, but Twilight reverses it, where the girl is underage and the vampire is like over 100 or whatever. I haven't read it, but I'm familiar with the story. So it's a problematic thing that happens a lot in vampire lore because the vampires are typically much older than their human companions. And why vampires need human companions, well, that's an interesting thing. Many vampire stories, the humans are just, basically things they feed from. And they have no necessary emotional attachment. In fact, the idea that a vampire has emotions, um, if you read where our modern conception of vampires come from, Dracula, if you read that, Dracula has no emotional life. He doesn't care about anything except himself. And there's some hints of that, I think, in other popular vampire lore, like I believe Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, there are some problems there with some of those vampires that you have vampires who really just don't care about anything but themselves, and then you have the other sort of newer vampires who maybe do care and that kind of thing. This is often a conflict in vampire lore. I believe it's part of the conflict that happens in Twilight is that the Cullen clan actually does care somewhat, does have some morality, but not all vampires are cryptids, because there's also werewolves in that story. Not all cryptids necessarily do. At least that's my understanding. I have not read it. So in this case, care very much for the humans because the humans are what are called symbiotes. And symbiotes, as the name implies, live in a symbiotic relationship. Remember, she's 53, but still a child. Well, that's because Ina lived to be 500 or 600 or something like that. And so she's, our equivalent of 10, like I said. Um, so, uh, anyway, so this is a creepy part of the book, and it was meant to be creepy, apparently. It was meant to be challenging to some of our ideals. But more importantly, is her skin color. Because as the story continues, and what she does as symbiote is when she feeds, she when she feeds on a human, she bites them. Her saliva and induces a drug, a chemical into the blood, which causes addiction and causes attachment. But it works both ways. She's not necessarily as attached to the symbiote, but the symbiote is very much attached to her, very much like a lover. Um, and the entire biting is an orgasmic, erotic thing, as often is the case in vampire lore. In fact, I'm wondering if Stephanie Meyer may have read this book. Not that I think she copied it in any way, but I think that between what Anne Rice was doing and what Butler is doing here, just sort of sets the stage for this romantic lead of the Cullen people in Twilight. I don't think that just came out of nowhere. And there's other vampire romance too. I'm not familiar with the genre, but I know that there are. And this is, in some respects, an outlier because it's by a writer who is not known for vampire stories. And this is really kind of vampire lore as science fiction. Because, like I said, she creates a plausible reason for what's going on here. In fact, this book, the characters dismiss the majority of vampire lore, saying that's just crazy folklore that humans have written. That some of it does probably relate to Ina over time, but a lot of it is made up stuff. Ina are not your typical vampires. They can't get out. They can't go out in the day because of their lack of melanin. They burn really quickly. Sure, he does not. And this is where the main plot of the story begins. Is because she's a genetic experiment and because she's darker skinned, she has advantages like being able to stay awake and go out in the day. Now, she has to be covered from direct sunlight, but she can go out in the day and she can be awake during the day. Other Ina just basically pass out and are in comatose, which leads their communities to be very vulnerable during the day. And that's what's happened. The place where she wakes up turns out to be her home, which was destroyed by unknown factors. And she's the only one who survives. And as it turns out, as we get further into the story, the reason why it was destroyed was because of her, because of racism, because of her dark skin, because of a concern for miscegenation and and what she represents. And it turns out that there are a couple of families that are very old in the Eno world who don't like darker skinned people as well, that they're just plain racist as well as being speciesist. And this plays through. And so what Butler has done here is she's taken the trope of blackness, which is normally seen as a weakness or a defect, and she's made it actually a strength. Uh, uh, Her attachments are faster and more deep with her symbionts. She is an extremely moral person. Um, they don't kill humans, not on purpose anyway. They can, of course, but they don't on purpose, and they don't enslave humans usually unwillingly. Now they're capable of doing so. They're capable of altering human memory and things of that nature, and they do that to protect themselves. But broadly speaking, the symbiosis is real. Remember that attachment drug, well, it makes the symbionts live longer too. So instead of the normal human lifespan of 70, 80, symbionts live 200 or so. So it more than doubles their lifespan and gives them a better healing factor as well. So it is beneficial in some respects. Now, it does mean that they have to accept other relationships. A an Ina needs, you know, up to a dozen symbiotes in order to survive. Because if they have too few, they will weaken them too much by taking their blood too often. And although they can just randomly feed, they don't like to. They only do that in necessity or when they're traveling or something like that. And they don't like to travel because they can't. They just basically become comatose and too vulnerable during the day when they travel. They need too many symbiotes with them. And if you're taking symbiotes with you when you travel, why would you go out, feeding on randoms? Although they can do it, it's not a common thing. In any case, uh, so what she's done here at the end is there's a very long trial of the guilty parties, and the racism is talked about, and her strengths are talked about. It's very, very interesting. But I have to say that overall, you just have to deal with the creepiness of this 10, 11-year old um, and enslaving these people to her, or and that's a word that I don't think is used except once or twice, and not by the Ina. That's used by the symbiotes in some cases. They don't, and it's sort of a willing enslavement. And so you just have to deal with the fact that there's some creepiness here. That she's in these physical, romanticized, erotic relationships with adults. Uh, like I said, she is not an adult. Physically, her body is immature. So it's fiction. It's clearly fiction, but still, it's a bit of a creepy depiction. And we'll say this: you will never see a faithful production of this. It simply cannot happen. Sure, the few and very briefly described actual sex scenes can be skipped or just alluded to, but I doubt that you can even have the constant kind of touching and looking and sitting in laps and stuff that does take place, because the bite itself is erotic. I doubt you can have that with a 10, 11-year old, or even a 14-year old playing an 11-year old, as they did in one of the Lolita movies. So you're never going to see a faithful reproduction of this, which is in some respects a shame because I think it's a fascinating story and a fascinating idea. But most people aren't going to read a 300-page book, and that's just the way it is. So they want to see the movie, and the movie will never be faithful. You could maybe do this with a 16-year-old vampire or something, but then that loses its edge because we all know that 16-year-olds do have a sexual body. So that's a little bit of a different uh, idea. Although obviously 16 is still illegal for an adult, we do realize that a 16-year-old has a sexuality. So it's a little bit different. Um, that said, it's a good book, but just be aware the creepiness is there, and if you're triggered by that kind of thing, this would not be the book for you. It is not the focal point by any means, but it is there, and Butler is, aware of it being there, and she does not shy away from the implications. So you need to know that. That said, interesting book, good book. It's a shame she didn't get to finish the series. It'd be nice to see where she would have gone with this. Um, the world that she created for the Ina is fascinating, and she left their exact origins unknown. Not even clear she was planning to clear it up, but They could be aliens, they could be an offshoot of humans, they could be something else. The book doesn't make it clear. There could be an overriding spirituality. They do have a goddess of some kind, but not all of them follow it. They become more secularized over time, like human societies have. So who knows? But recommend it for those who can handle the potential difficulties.